Welcome to the Speckled Truth Podcast. This is the only show dedicated to the conservation of the trophy trout population from the East Coast to the Gulf Coast. Here, we go below the surface to discuss what happens when science and anglers work together for a cause. Gear up with your host, Captain Chris Bush, a trophy trout purist, leader and educator within the fishing community, as he talks about all things big speckled trout. Get ready for the slimy, salty truth, better known as the Speckled Truth.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Speckled Truth Podcast. Captain Chris. I'm actually joined this morning, believe it or not, on a Saturday morning here recording, and thank God for super smart people like Miss Merrill and Van Grafton who produced the show. But I'm here with Doc Weiss, and today we're going to talk about kind of an angling addiction and his angling addiction. And so, Doc, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome, sir. Well, hey, before we go ahead and get into it, because we're gonna cover a lot of things, I want to ask you, just for our listeners out there, go ahead and tell them a little bit about yourself and kind of where you're from and what you do.
Well, I'm from New Orleans and lived there for 21 years, 22 years until I moved to Slidell in 1971. Mm-hmm. But I grew up very close to Bayou St. John and City Park, which were wonderful fisheries for a kid. And I started fishing very young, and very first fish that I caught thrilled me so much I wanted to do it again and again and again. And nobody could really understand that. Least of which were my parents. Maybe my dad understood, but my mother could never understand how somebody could get so interested in fishing and fishing over and over again. I was a pest and aggravated them to want to do this all the time, even at a young age. In any case, so lots of time has passed since then. And in retrospect, and I think like other addictions that are not caused by external factors like opioids, endorphins are a hormone that are released by your pituitary and stimulate your brain to give you pleasure, relaxation. And it's good enough to want to do it again. So runners experience it, people who work out experience it, et cetera. In the list of categories in the say psychiatric journals, there is not a list of a fishing addiction per se, but there's lots of literature on it and other similar quotes addictions, and these are naturally released hormones that give you pleasure, and I think that's the best way that I can describe my addiction, and it's not curable. And like some other addictions, you wonder if it's ever going to end, and it never does. And the bottom line to all of this is I still have a thrill when I get a bite, feel a fish pull, and it's not gotten any less pleasurable to me to do it. So I know that this is the speckled truth, and I know that it's great big speckled trout, and I have had my pleasure of the great big speckled trout, but lots of other types of fish too. Mm-hmm. And I've been fortunate enough to do a bunch of different things, all of them fishing related and different species. But the big trout, and I talked with Gerald Horst about this yesterday for a good while, at least a half an hour. And his conclusion is that big trout are different from other trout, period, whether they're here or in Florida or in Texas. And he can't say why one fish is that much bigger than the other, or if one 3-year-old fish weighs 5 pounds and another 5-year-old fish only weighs 5 pounds. It's mostly, he thinks, a genetic thing. He can list areas that consistently these big fish have come from, but it's hard to say exactly why. And I think personally, it has more to do with habitat. And we touched on that a little bit yesterday about where they come from. And his collection of big fish and otoliths that he did a few years ago were the mouth of the river, Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Calcasieu, and he said Vermilion Bay was a sleeper area. There have been some big fish recently caught in the Grand Isle area, but they're not real big fish. They're not 30-inch fish. That's 6-pound fish. And a 7-pound fish in Grand Isle is still pretty unusual. But that's basically it. So if you want to catch, in my opinion, a big fish, very simply, you have to go fish where big fish live. You're not going to catch them under birds in Delacroix. If you keep up with what's been going on and you read reports, which most all of us do, the big fish every year come from the same places. So if you want to catch a big fish, you go sit at the end of the rocks at South Pass, or you sit at the point of Treasure Isle, which is 2 casts from my house, or the L&N Bridge, or you just sit and you wait. It's a waiting game, and you can put out of your mind catching a bunch of big fish. If you're catching a bunch of fish between, even 2 to 4 pounders and a bunch of them, you're not going to catch a giant fish. Almost every fish that I know of, really big fish, was by himself, and not a bunch of big fish at the same time. So that's the biggest difference for me.
Yeah.
And at this stage in my career, I'm happy to still be able to go frequently. I've run into lots and lots of people over the years who also have this same addiction, if you want to call it. And I'm happy for it. In any case, this morning I made a list of names of people that I've run into, and it reads like a who's who of who caught fish in Louisiana. So maybe later in the podcast we can talk about that too. But in any case, I started at a very young age catching perch, mullets, anything that would bite on a cane pole and a piece of bread.
Yeah.
And that has evolved to where I am today.
Yeah. So you're a doctor. So what type of doctor would you practice?
I practiced general practice.
Okay.
I moved to Slidell in 1971 and opened a practice. Okay. I practiced for 35 years and then retired. And mine was a real general practice where I had a year of surgical training and some urology. So when I started practice, GPs did everything: fixed broken bones, delivered babies, fixed hernias, etc. So I did a lot more than just referrals, and I loved it, and I would do it again. But after 35 years, that was enough, and I have something to do.
Right.
I went yesterday to a luncheon of guys that I went to high school with over 50 years ago, and some of them are still doing what they did, whether they're lawyers or this or that, a couple of doctors, and they're doing it because they love it, but also because they don't have a separate passion or passion to go to do something else, whether it's so anyway, 35 years was enough for me. I had a great time, and I loved it, and I did it again. So in general, I guess you would call me an old general practitioner.
I got you. Now, what high school did you go to in the city of New Orleans?
I went to Jesuit in New Orleans.
Jesuit, Doc. I'm a Rummel Raider.
Well, that's okay. I won't hold it against you.
Likewise,
I've got good friends that are Rummel Raiders, like Don Dubuque. In any case, my son Robert, who teaches at Jesuit now, and he's been a high school teacher since he graduated from college, taught at Rummel for a number of years. So
that's awesome. So
go ahead.
No, I was going to ask. So like when you were actually practicing and stuff like that, so like me, I'm in the military, and so I move around, and I would quote unquote say that I have an addiction, and like you growing up in the city of New Orleans had that addiction at a young age. It started actually in a farm pond in Kiln, Mississippi, where we're fortunate enough to have some property there. My folks got some land, and so we started fishing for brim right off the pier, using bread balls and a little red and white cork, and so that naturally evolved into catching some bass, and then I remember catching that my first bass so vividly. I actually wrote a story about it called A Devil Horse and a Debt of Gratitude, and it was with my brother. We were actually at a neighbor's pond, and I was throwing a devil's horse, And I remember him and his friend Eric Killian fishing there and not having any luck. And I was a tag along, and I just loved that. I just loved being around nature and fishing and anything. And I loved lures because I had cool eyes and all these other things. And so, man, I started building up my own tackle repertoire and everything else. Well, needless to say, I wanted to learn how to cast a spinning rod. And so my brother towards the very end was like, come on, Chris, I'll teach you how to cast a spinning rod. And so they had that little bitty frog pattern devil's horse. And sure enough, I caught my first bass. I'll never forget that moment. But my point where I was going with this is that, like you, has never subsided. Now I'm in a 15-year military career, and I've tried to feed the addiction, quote unquote, feed the addiction through fishing. And fortunately enough, again, the Air Force has been kind where I've pretty much been able to pursue speckled trout, which is truly my passion throughout. So my question to you is, like me, when you were kind of practicing and all these things, did you still have that same zeal and level of passion where it was still just always going fishing and kind of feeding the addiction throughout and providing for a family and that type of stuff?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you started the exact same way that I did,
As most, I'm sure,
which is in a pond with a Smithwick, if you don't remember who made them,
Yep.
devil horse. But I read everything as a kid that I could about fishing, and my main source of reading was Field and Stream magazines. I can remember articles that I read back then and reread them. I can remember on Bayou St. John catching brim on flies that I made. I can remember the first bass that I caught, the first bass in general that I caught on the old cream scoundrel worm.
Yeah.
And I used to get my dad to buy them. They came in a 3-pack from Montgomery Ward, and you could buy them from the catalog, and they were natural colored worms, but they were too small. They were about 6 inches, and I used to heat the ends of them and make them bigger. I used to make hooks with weed guards on them, and I would, every single day that I could when I was a kid, get to the back of City Park as early as I could and spend the whole day and catch green trout, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's a little digression, but yes, I practiced medicine and had 5 kids, and I was very, very busy, but one way or other, I always got to fish. I was off every Wednesday and about every third or fourth weekend when I started practice. And those mornings that I fished, and to this day, I have never been a cant-to-cant fisherman. Do you know what a cant-to-cant fisherman is?
No, sure. I know.
Can't see in the morning and you can't see in the evening when you get home. So that means all day.
Yeah.
I was always limited to half a day because with the practice and the kids and so forth.
Yeah.
So I'd go early. I was off on Wednesdays, would go early Wednesday morning and be home before noon. So anyway, the first fishing that I did here in Slidell was bass fishing. We started a bass club called the Honey Island Bassmasters. There were about 20 of us, and all of us addicts, and several of them are still fishing. A couple of them became professional fishermen, guides. So that was the first phase, was really bass fishing. Although I had some exposure to speckled trout fishing in high school, the trout fishing was so good it was silly. But in any case, those were trips to Empire jetties out in the Gulf. Big trout, one after another. Ho hum. Nobody worried about how big they were or what they weighed or whether they had otoliths or not. So
and that's my dad. So my dad was the first podcast, and I mean, again, him obviously being my dad, him sharing those stories, and I've heard them, and the fact that he's actually even shared more in the podcast that I have never heard before. So yeah, I mean, listening to stories that my dad has is amazing of the times back then. And like you're saying, it was ho hum, fishing the same side of the West Delta, or the west side of the Delta, him duck hunting down there. It was like, from what I can envision, looking through his eyes, truly a sportsman's paradise where ducks were endless and the marsh was, just
A
teeming with
lot.
life, and speckled trout, redfish everywhere. I mean, just you name it.
Mhm. Well, I think one comment I'd like to make with about what you just said is going down to the Venice area or even around here in the Slidell, Lake Pontchartrain area. I have seen so much of a change in habitat that if people are wondering where the fish went, there just isn't habitat like there used to be to support that
Yeah,
body of
biomass. Yeah.
biomass, and not just year to year, but if you go regularly, you see the change much quicker than that.
Hmm.
If you could picture, for instance, the shorelines in Venice, say between South Pass and the Main Pass area, the undulations are ins and outs of the shorelines, and the ponds, they don't exist anymore.
Mm.
Back when I fished a lot in Yellow Cotton Bay and Hospital Bay, those were real bays. They had a lot of inlets, they had a lot of ponds, they had a lot of beautiful grass, they had crystal clear water. Hospital Bay and Yellow Cotton Bay are not on any maps anymore. They
Yeah,
don't exist.
they're the Gulf. I mean, they're
They're
really
the
an
Gulf of
extension of the
Mexico.
Gulf. Yeah, I agree.
And if you think about the little bitty things, larvae and baby shrimp and pogies and
Yeah.
whatever, that's gone. That's gone. And I think that also the good areas, really good areas, there used to be a gazillion of them.
Yeah.
Now there are only a few, and everybody knows where those few areas are. And considering the number of people who fish, advancements in electronics,
Yeah.
the number of people who fish, the multiplication of guides, there's a lot of pressure on the fish, a lot.
So
And not just here, not just in Louisiana, but up and down the coast.
yeah, I mean, social media is exacerbated and made kind of fishing areas much smaller. I'm not going to lie. I mean, probably certainly guilty and contribute to that, right? In terms of speckled truth, we try not to share spots, but just general locations, but still people are hungry for that information that we
Sure.
once were hungry for, but you had to kind of know a secret handshake and a secret duress code before you got access to that information before, as opposed to now it's pretty accessible, right? I mean, if you got a
Sure.
YouTube account, or actually you don't even need one, just go to YouTube, you can
Mhm.
probably find at least, or you can be far off if you're just getting into fishing now than you obviously were back
Mhm.
then. But I,
Right.
I don't want to digress too far down that, because I mean, God, we
Okay.
can do an entire show with
I think
regards.
you and I could
Oh my
talk right
God.
now until till I would have to stop at the start of the LSU game.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I know. I don't want to miss that either. But we were talking about an angling addiction, right? And so you share with me a couple of stories before us actually recording this. And so one of those was, I believe, going in search of peacock bass. Can you
Oh
tell me
gosh,
how bad
that was a great
that
time.
addiction runs deep in your bones?
Oh wow! I would say that if there was one species of fish that, if it was close enough for me to do or repeat what it used to be, that would be the one fish that I would be interested in going back to catch more of. I had had a bass addiction a little bit before that. I went to Lake Guerrero several times
Hmm.
and caught the last trip that I made. I caught a 13 and a quarter pound bass and plenty tens then, and I love to do it. And I went a number of times, but a good friend of mine named Jim Lamarck,
Uh-huh.
who is a full-time guide here
Uh-huh.
in Louisiana, had been running big boats for people in Florida, and he met a guy who had been to Venezuela, and he went, had a great time, told me about it, and then I went with him one time, had a great time, and we planned a trip with several of the friends of ours here in Slidell. There were about 5 of us who flew to a little river in Venezuela. The name of the river is the Sinaruco. And in any case, we had a great trip. The plane, it was in a small camp on the river,
Uh-huh.
very primitive. And the pilot called us after we had, on the day that we were supposed to leave, he called us to tell us he was going to fly in and stop just for a very short period of time, take off. He wanted us right on the airstrip. It was a dirt airstrip next to the camp.
And what year was this? What year was this?
This was in about 1992 or three, I think. In any case, so the plane flies in and lands and taxis and turns around, and the pilot jumps out the plane, and we heard some popping noise, which we thought were firecrackers from the kids in the camp. And it turned out to be four banditos who surrounded us. Each of them had a Uzi, an automatic handgun in one hand and a hand grenade with the pin out in the other hand. So, needless to say, that was very alarming. But in any case, they put the pilot back in the plane, one of the camp owners, and they put all of us in the plane. But it was a very small plane, so 5 of us got in, 4 of us had to get out, and I was lucky enough to be the one to get out. So they got back in the plane and took off. We were about 60 miles from Columbia, and it turned out it was a kidnapping, ransom. They wanted the plane, and they wanted some money for the people that were on it. So Jim Lamarck, I still talk to him twice a week. He's still a good friend. It was a terrible, harrowing experience for him.
Yeah.
Anyway, nobody went back except for me. And
which
when I
is
started,
crazy to me when you were telling me the story.
I know,
like,
it's
everybody
crazy
went
to
back except
everybody
for me.
else.
I'm like, yeah.
Well, I went again almost once or twice a year for the next almost 10 years. And back then, the fishery was very, very, wasn't explored much at all.
Mm-hmm.
There was one guy who I used to see on television, and we passed a couple of times in camps, who you see on television now, named Larry Dahlberg.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a long running. He fished there a lot, and it was primitive then. We didn't have ice. We didn't have formal camps. There were no houseboats, and the fishing was unbelievable. These fish, if you judge the size of a fish that you're going to catch or target, it's a 7-pound trout.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 10-pound bass, and it's a 20-pound peacock bass. And a 20-pound peacock bass caught in a lagoon that explodes on a fish is spectacular. They're beautiful fish. They hit hard. They fight hard. The bait that we use, you're talking about a Smithwick devil horse. This was a big game Lure Jensen wood chopper, 7 inches long with a big propeller on the back end. And you just throw it as far as you can and just start ripping it, and they explode. I'm sure you've seen a lot of programs on TV with it, but like other things, you can't appreciate the beauty of the fish, how hard it fights, and the habitat that you're in. And those days fishing regularly in both Venezuela and Brazil were incredible. It started to slow down at the last few years that I went, so I kind of quit going, and that's about the time that I got interested in catching big trout.
Right.
But that was the most spectacular fishing that I have ever experienced. Peacock bass in Brazil and in Venezuela.
And I've seen. So it's funny you mentioned that, because again, growing up, I would wake up early, and I'd tune into the TNN or ESPN and watch, Outdoors with Jimmy Houston. The Hunt for Big Fish with Larry Dahlberg was one of those, and I remember distinctly, kind of like that big, dual propped or whatever it is, but a big commotion topwater bait just getting imploded on. And so it's, the fact that you were there living that.
I was there right when it started, right when Larry Dahlberg started going down there. There's a book, if anybody's interested, that I haven't seen in a long time, that was written by an author named, I can't think of his name right now, but it was Peacock Explosions. The author was Larry Larson. That's a book I could have read over and over and over again. And then having been there, can appreciate exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah.
peacock explosions. That's the only way you can describe what a hit from a really big peacock bass is like. An explosion, and it's usually close. It's not like, having a tuna hit or a marlin hit
Yeah.
500 yards from the boat. This is right in your face.
Yeah.
It scares you. But in any case, we caught a lot of big fish down there, and the fishery is just not the same. First of all, Venezuela, I think Americans are not welcome anymore. And the places in Brazil now have become commercialized, mostly with big houseboats. And you'll see in a kind of an isolated area several houseboats that can accommodate 12 to maybe 20 people. And you fly in and out to them on a little float plane. But the fishing is just not the same as it used to be. So anyway, that was one phase of my
Yeah.
addiction.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact is that, I mean, you went back after
Oh,
that harrowing. I mean, that would literally. So look, I'm in the military, and I've served during OIF or Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom and Inherent Resolve and all these different, you know, operations to go and fight, ISIS, Al Qaeda, in Afghanistan, Iraq, northern Syria, stuff like that. Right? I haven't seen my.
That's the real deal. But one thing I have to say that gave my family some solace was the fact that after that episode in that particular camp, they stationed some National Guard troops when the fishermen were in the camp
Yeah.
to protect us, number one. And I found out that hostage insurance was available, which I bought. And there were so many kidnappings that after a few years, I think the insurance company went bankrupt, and we didn't get hostage insurance
Oh
anymore.
my God, Doc.
But anyway,
Yeah.
that's another good story.
Oh my God. Yeah, but I mean, my equivalent would be like, yeah, let's go back to Afghanistan in the mid 2000s, or early Iraq, just for the fun of it, so we can go catch some, big
Well, I
fish.
think the example is not
Like what?
that I'm crazy. It's that, man, it was so good. I had to go back. And that's part of what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Compulsively fishing, almost
Yeah.
compulsive.
So you alluded to, though, that's about the time you started targeting big trout. So let me back up a little bit. When you were growing up, I mean, fishing out of Empire, you kind of said that you were catching trout, but were you really truly like a trout fisherman at that point?
No, not really.
Okay.
No, that was the fish to go catch, but
Yeah.
it wasn't like, let's see if we can catch a big one. It's let's see how many ice chests we can fill up. And my first fishing actually was in high school. I had a friend whose name was Jack Van Geffen, and I can't remember his daddy's name, but he lived in New Orleans. And he was always looking for somebody to go fishing with him. And I would go fishing with him, and we would, beautiful trout. We would go out of the Empire jetties, drop a trawl, catch croakers. This was mostly in the spring and in the summer. Catch croakers, go out to the Green Monster, the compressor rig. I'm sure you've heard of those. Your daddy knows those. And we would go to Tremé or Battistella's and sell the fish. And he would give me my share after expenses. And he would always have a highball after we went fishing, and I would have to clean the boat. So that was fine with me.
Yeah.
I was probably, like 12, 13, 14. So that was back in the day. And it kind of diminished I don't guess anybody thought back then that speckled trout would ever be hard to catch, or there wouldn't be a total abundance of them. It was only after a period of time that to catch a big trout was important. And I think a lot had to do with the advent of CCA and the CCA STAR. And there were some rodeos back then, like Grand Isle and Empire and so forth, that people would fish. But that's kind of evolved to club fishing, so to speak. And for instance, one that we fished a bunch was Toth. It's a Mardi Gras group that sponsors a fishing tournament. There's another one in Thibodeau, and the name I can't remember. But then the high schools had fishing rodeos, so we fished a bunch of those. And there was a really good friend. I hadn't even thought about fishing a rodeo, but a friend of mine named Ricky Trahant, who is a really good trout fisherman, that I fished with him a lot here in Lake Pontchartrain and Seabrook and the Causeway area. Well, let's enter this rodeo. Well, we did, and we won, and that was fun. And I think the first 5 straight that we fished in, we won. And one of them was right now I'm sitting 100 yards from where we caught the fish.
No kidding.
And this rodeo we caught a fish. It was a Friday and a Saturday rodeo, I think, maybe a Saturday and a Sunday. But the first day, all of our fish were over 5 pounds, and we thought that was pretty good. The next day, we eliminated every one of those fish, and we had 3 6s and 2 7s, and had that's the biggest string that I've caught
Personally. So 3
personally.
6s and 2 7s, yeah.
Right. But that same year, which was 2012, was the year that I won the Star. And I did it by continuing every day for weeks to go back to that same spot and try to catch another big fish. And I did. I caught one a little over 7. It got bumped. And then I caught one a little over 8. And so that year I was first and third. And that was kind of a climax or epiphany. That was plenty enough for me to not be so doggedly determined to catch a single big fish, because believe me, it takes a mental attitude that I'm going to go and spend a whole day in one spot to maybe just have a couple of 3 bites for the chance of catching one really big fish. And that's another subject that I would like to touch on, and because you always talk about what does it take to catch a big fish. It takes going to a place. This is the most important thing, where big fish live, number one, and then spending the time there to a lot of time to finally catch one, and to not be frustrated if you're only catching 2 or 3 fish a day, assuming that they're big. You at least have a chance of catching a big fish. In the lake itself, I've caught 2 fish over 9 pounds. Both of them were on terrible days where I did not catch anything but those one big fish. You know, how does that happen? It means that you're fishing for a big fish, and if you caught 10 2-pounders, that wouldn't be any good. But I was fishing in places where they were good. They were both on plastic, and I remember those fish like yesterday.
So I was going to ask you, though. I mean, of course, you've transitioned mentally as a big trout fisherman over. Let me ask that question, right? Have you, since you started targeting trout and big trout in the early 90s, is that something you developed over the course of time, or was that something when you came into targeting big fish in the early 90s in the Pontchartrain Basin right there out of New Orleans? Is that something you had?
You mean, did you develop
the mindset, like the big mindset where, hey, look, I'm leaving numbers. I'm looking for big bites, and I got to basically slow down, be patient, expectation management, all that stuff.
Well, a lot of our incentive around here really surrounds what Kenny Krieger did, and I can't remember the exact year that he caught his 11.99.
I think it was 99
trout. That was an incentive for everybody to try to catch a big fish. We were catching big fish, but not like he made on that particular day. And then I'm looking right now at the Wrigley's Bridge. Jason Troulier, who's a young guy whose daddy is an ultimate shrimper. Dune Troulier catches bait for the Wrigley's. Anyway, he caught one 11.2. Those are the 2 biggest trout in Louisiana records, I think. I don't think they're any bigger than Jason's and Kenny Krieger's. As many big trout have been caught over the years, including Dudley's and Ed Sexton's, et cetera, et cetera. But those big fish were kind of the incentives for some of us who are really interested in fishing to target big fish. I could name the people and the fish, almost every big fish in the lake over the last several years. The 2 9s that I had, I don't know another one over 9 that was caught after the last 9 that I caught, and that was around the Katrina. That was right after Katrina, right before Katrina, same year as Katrina. So that's a long time ago to not see another really big fish around here.
Yeah, but when did they close the Mr. Go?
I can't tell you when they closed the Mr. Go, but I would say the biggest suffering of fishing from the closing of the Mystico was shutting down Seabrook,
Yeah.
which is where tremendous number of gorgeous fish were caught year after year after year. The water just doesn't flow anymore. And not only that, it used to be a great place to shrimp. There's no shrimp around there anymore either. Now, the fish have moved to, behind the lock system in the Mystico, which is where I've been fishing lately, but
Right.
they're not big fish. I mean, a 3-pound fish is something to be excited about.
Right.
So where did all the big fish go? I don't know.
And that,
Like I said, it's habitat change. It's all kinds of
yeah,
different things.
the reason I mention that though, and that's just because the Mister Go, by virtue of its accessibility running out through into Breton Sound, just gave you almost like a funnel of just
Straight shot.
high salinity, right? So it kept the eastern basin of the Pontchartrain pretty salty throughout the year, right? And so
Yes.
what I've seen in my own personal uh, pursuit, more or less, and kind of moving around fishery to fishery and having fished, in 7 different states and targeted big fish in those 7 states, is that, and you can ask some of the guys, McBride and Watkins, and some of those guys that do target and have done so for decades, is that salinity is a big deal to big fish. And so high salinity environments, the IRL down here in Laguna Madre, super high salty hypersaline environments obviously produce big fish. Now North Carolina is an anomaly to me because this year they've actually reported a lot of really big fish, to include a couple 30 inchers just this year. And so now that's not at least from what I understand, it's not the hypersaline environment that we have here. But I just needed to dive, or maybe if I'd actually like to get somebody from North Carolina on the podcast at some point, because I want to learn a little bit more about it, And so anyway, I say all that because I think damming the Mr. Go, yeah, like you were saying, the Seabrook area just went kaput.
Well, not only that, all of the levees and so forth, we don't have the flow in and out of Lake Pontchartrain that we did, and the causeway, which used to be a great place to fish, and that was of course on the bridges mostly, and there are a few man-made reefs that were made over there that were just terrific for a number of years. They're not producing much anymore.
Yeah,
I'll hear occasionally of a good catch there, and that was all plastic fishing, which was really fun. Right on the legs of the twin span. I mean the causeway itself.
So to give you an idea, I grew up on the South Shore, and playing baseball at Delgado, we would outlook, again, being super addicted to fishing. We would, before practice, so after school, before practice, or before school, Brandon Treadaway, my old tournament partner, my best friend there, still lives in Kenner. He and I would go fishing before class, and we would go wade over at the Lakeville pumping station, and we would catch a limited speckled trout wade fishing the fringes of Pontchartrain, and that's pretty far west. I mean, you're talking west of Causeway. Now, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it was awesome when you can go before class, wade fish along the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. We'd throw them in an ice chest, go to class, go to practice, come home, clean them up, and maybe even go do it that afternoon or that evening. So it was an amazing fishery. I like Pontchartrain.
I hate to digress, but I can remember back in my Jesuit high school days, one time I went to City Park between the end of school and the start of a baseball playoff game. I don't think we were playing Rummel then, but in any case, I went to City Park, caught a 5-pound bass. I couldn't bring him home because my parents would realize that I had been fishing between school and the baseball game. I put him in a bucket. We won the game, and I brought him in the shower after the game to show everybody. And and an old City Park fisherman whose name was Morell, Harry Morell's dad, I showed him the fish, and he was a big City Park fisherman, and he was dabbling in taxidermy. He said, well, could I have the fish? And I gave him the fish, and about 6 months later, he appeared at my house and had the fish mounted. That was my first mounted fish. But in any case, I skipped school, skipped church, skipped a lot of different things to sneak out to go fishing. Don't get me started on that, or we'll run overtime for sure.
No, but
But anyway, back to whatever subject you want to pick up.
I was going to say, though, I think a lot of our listeners can empathize with that, regardless of fishery, is that chances are, if you're a big trout guy, follower of speckled truth, you have, let's face it, it's probably something mentally wrong with you look, you don't live to fish, right? You fish to live.
Yeah.
And so,
Right. There's no question about it.
It's crazy. And so I think a lot of folks can empathize and have stories of their own that they can share. Is that, yeah, I probably, like 2 weeks ago, I stretched the limits with my own family here. I'll be the first to admit it. And so I told my wife I'd be home at 1. I just missed a huge trout, not going to lie. And so, but the bite was really off, and I only had 6 bites all day, caught 3 fish. And I had one that was just it could have been 30. Needless to say, lost it. And so I knew I was coming into a mid-afternoon major, and I told my wife I'd be home at 1. And so I texted her, and the text never went through. And so thinking that the text had gone through, I fished into, let's say, 2:30, 3 o'clock. I got off the water. I called her. And she's like, where, like all of a sudden,
where have you been?
like going crazy. My dad's texting me. I got 800 missed calls, and my wife's like, where are you? I finally I'm like, I'm leaving fishing now. What's going on? She's like, you were like 10 minutes away from us calling a Coast Guard.
Oh, wow.
Like, I sent you a text, and she's like, well, I never got, needless to say, but with us, right. And folks that live to fish, we will always push the limits, right? And so that I think,
and you can appreciate exactly what you're saying. One thing in the last podcast that I noted, and that's almost exactly what you're telling me right now, is your friend that caught the big trout on the 2-pound tippet.
Oh, Doc J. Wright.
Said that if he hadn't stopped on his way home to check one place out, where he later caught the big fish, he wouldn't have caught it. But anyway, those are all things. There are other things. I'll tell you, not to digress, but to get back to the big trout thing, was right at the tail end or during the time that I was going to Venezuela, and a lot of our fish that we caught were on jigs. Well, it turned out plastic didn't work very well on jigs, but I went to get a haircut at a barbershop, and the girl there was looking at my fishing pictures. Oh, my daddy is Dudley Vandenborg, because I caught those fish on a straight tail big Dudley. And that's basically how I met Dudley the first time. Okay. And he is really a remarkable character. And I know that I mentioned to you, and you asked me who's the best, and I told you what my impression was. There's first, there's good, there's better, there's best, and then there's Dudley. And I think, at least in my circle, which is pretty big, there's general acceptance that he's the Michael Jordan of trout fishing in this part of Louisiana, by far. And a super nice guy, willing to share information, loves to talk about it. Yeah. Did very well making the lures, and just recently sold V&G lures, which is a Deadly Dudley plastic bait. So I would strongly suggest that one day you get him on a podcast and try to pick his brain. He knows everybody, everything, and he is really passionate about trout fishing.
Hey everyone, I'd like to take a small break to sincerely thank our podcast sponsors. As you know, we're a brand about sharing the passion and pursuit of trophy speckled trout, as well as our conservation. Fortunately for us, Mirror, Texas Custom Lures, and the original Custom Corky support that same passion, which is evident through the support of this podcast. Simply put, without these brands, none of this would be possible. And we're incredibly appreciative, and we hope you are too. Now, let's get back to the discussion. I was kind of sifting through social media this morning, and because Rummel won the state championship yesterday, and so one of them was
in what football?
So they beat Catholic of Baton Rouge, and so when I was sifting through there, I noticed that Rummel had a fishing club, and I'm like, oh my God, if they had a fishing club back when I would have never got anything done. But
Jesuit has one now too.
yeah, so I remember though, as a student, this is from 95 to 99. I remember going with my dad to listen to Dudley give a discussion about, and it was him, Brad Schmidt, Captain Brad Schmidt, who's a Rummel alum, and
Yeah, well, Brad started fishing with
Nash.
Little Nash.
Yep, absolutely.
That's Little Nash to us,
Right.
and great guy.
Yeah.
Golly, what a good guy.
Yes, sir. And so, but I remember listening to Dudley, and this is at the very start of him actually coming out with V&G lures. And so we would actually wade fish the surf and fish in Port Sulphur. And my favorite to this day, and you can't find them, and I don't think they're actually made at all. And so if Mr. Paul's listening, he owns Dudley now, but it's a little Dudley Jr., not the terratail, but the little straight tail. And it's called tangerine, the color. It's like an avocado, real light avocado.
Well, I know the color. I have them.
Yeah. Okay. Send them my way. No, but no, with a little silver and a little orange fleck. And my God, Doc, we would wade the surf right there in Port Sulphur and Empire and just maul.
I believe it. I really do believe it. My two biggest trout here in Lake Pontchartrain, one was on a straight tail avocado red flake Dudley, and one was on a
blue moon,
the small one. Okay. No, the other one was on the same color avocado red flake terratail, and the small one. Both of those fish were on the small Dudleys with 3/8 ounce heads.
Is that your favorite color, Doc? Avocado?
No, I don't use it at all anymore.
Do you have a favorite color? Like if you had to have a go-to?
I would say blue moon. Yeah, I don't color. I'm not sure if it's that important, but
yeah, fishing by like the Great Wall right now. I mean, y'all tied in on a certain color.
I using shrimp Creole. Using the matrix shed in Magneto, which is a clear thing. It's just like a blue moon.
Yep.
Those colors are all very, very similar.
And so fishing a Pontchartrain complex, though, I mean, typically you have clear water, right? And a lot of that.
Not always. That never gets real clear, but clear. I mean, if you could see 2 feet, that's plenty.
Right.
Well, you usually don't have 2 feet of visibility.
And so we would fish again. Port Sulphur is what I would consider my home waters because we had a camp.
That would be clear.
In Happy Jack. So we actually used the blue moon with the chartreuse tail was pretty much our favorite, but actually the best bait ever, par none. And I still have some and I don't throw them at all, but it was a smoke 4-inch. It was a 4-inch smoke grub, a stingray tail grub made by H&H. And that on a for some ungodly reason, that combination, I think it's just black and chartreuse or, morning glory or whatever it was. But we did really well in Port Sulphur. That was pretty much that, and avocado and blue moon with chartreuse tail were pretty much the three. But I asked that just because if from a guy like you, who's fished a Pontchartrain complex, caught an absolute ton of fish, if you had like a certain favorite color or something that you kind of lean on.
I think I'd have to say, the blue moon.
Okay.
And to put a little chartreuse on the tail. I know he made some, and I do like the terratail.
Okay.
And then now the matrix shed is very popular. It's probably as popular, if not more popular than the Dudley, and their colors are great.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point too much. So you won the CCA Star. And this was in 2012.
2012, right.
And you won the CCA Star just the one time, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you've won multiple.
I may have a long time ago finished maybe second or third.
Okay.
A couple of times, but never won it before.
Okay. I was under the impression that you had won it a couple of times, but it's probably because every time you look in the eastern side of the state, you're always up there in one or two.
Some way.
Yeah.
Now, my son Philip, and that's how I got in touch with you, if you remember. I had read your articles in the Speckled Truth, and when Philip and I went back to Florida, I said, Philip, we're going to catch 2 over 30 inches, and we're going to sign up for the
Dirty 30.
Dirty 30.
Yes,
Well, guess what? Philip caught that giant fish, and that's how you and I met.
Yes, sir.
Philip, way back when CCA was starting, and I don't remember what year it was, there was a newcomers big trout statewide.
Okay.
And my son Philip caught a big trout right here in Lake Pontchartrain and won that. So there are two Weisses that have won stars,
Okay.
and he's one of them.
Okay. So maybe that's it. Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. So Philip, when he did register that fish, so fishing with Peter Deeks.
Oh, God.
Is that
Peter Deeks. If I had to go recommend one person, if you want to go catch a big trout, that's who you go with.
okay?
I don't know a lot about Florida, and maybe your other friend that did the last report knows a bunch of other people, but Peter Deeks is pretty well known. I had seen him on television catching big trout with Bill Dance. I called and set it up with him, and been 3 times, and all 3 have been very successful.
Gotcha. But live bait only.
And yes, but he targets. Now, I think he would take you if you want to go catch a bunch of fish somewhere else and catch fish.
Right.
But if you tell him, I want to catch a trophy trout, it's totally different from probably whatever else he does.
Gotcha. I gotcha.
He knows where, when, and how. Now, I know, especially from my bass club fishing exploits, that major periods are very, very important. But when I was practicing especially, I go when I can go. I'm sorry if it's a major period that I'm going to miss, but I do firmly believe that these big fish, including the ones here in the lake, can be caught with a higher degree of effectiveness during major periods.
And you talk
and our minor periods.
Yeah, so referencing Solinar.
Solinar tables and Tide. I think Tide and Solinar
they're interchangeable. Well, they're not.
They're interchangeable almost, but they're close. Yeah. But if I had to recommend, if I was given a little talk on fish, I would say go early in the morning, late in the evening, right before dark, or about 30 minutes to an hour before and after the tide changes.
Yeah.
The biggest fish we catch, I think, are right at the tide change.
Okay. Now, do you have a preference at any point in the month with regards to moon phase? Have you seen any?
No, I'm sure that there is some effect, but I have never been that scientific to do that. Now, I used to keep diaries, but the diary, after about 3 or 4 years, you realize this is time of year, etc.
Yeah.
It just repeats itself. The spots, the time of day, everything just repeats over and over again. It's almost like, why keep this? Because I know what's going to happen.
Yeah. No, because a reason I mentioned that, and I talked at length about it with Doc, and I think you heard that in that podcast, is that we try to get pretty daggum technical with regards to seeing trends, and certainly he kind of was willing to share that with his own pursuit of trying to really figure out a fishery depending on time of year where they're packing the most weight, because he's looking for a world record. I mean, every time.
Well, yeah, he's much more scientific than I ever dreamed of being.
Well, I try to do the same thing to some extent, just because I'm trying to optimize my time, but not only that, it's interesting to just understand a little bit more about those fish and in the fishery, and how those big fish react and respond. And so you kind of alluded to it a little bit, with regards to Dr. Horst. And actually, let's get into that a little bit. So you participated in a program, and I know you're probably going to be like, well, I don't remember the specifics about it, but it was called Trout Watchers, and it was a program.
But I do now because I talked to him yesterday about it.
Well, never mind.
And he said that I was wondering how I got involved. He says, "Well, you volunteered," and I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I didn't invite people to do it." He said, "I put out newsletters and I wrote an article about doing it, and anybody interested was willing to come." Well, I have a feeling it was mostly probably Dudley said, "Hey, I'm going to go to Baton Rouge to do this. Would you like to go with me?" I think that's probably how it happened.
Right.
So I went with Dudley, and he had 2 sessions, and I can't remember whether they were 2 separate years or 2 sessions in the same year.
Mm-hmm.
And he offered people to come who were interested to learn how to harvest a fish's otolith.
Okay.
And it was a whole process of taking the otolith out of the fish, not damaging it, how to submit it to him. And he did his studies based on the otoliths in terms of the fish's age. And of course, he would have accurate length and girth and weight of these fish. And I thought it went on for a long time, but he said it was only 2 years.
It was only 2 years. It was in the
Yes.
article that was, so the article itself was, it's interesting how things come full circle, because Chris Berzas, who is a longtime writer for Louisiana Sportsman as well as other publications, we've known each other now through writing for Louisiana Sportsman. And so we share some things, and he sent me this and he said, I think you'll be interested in this. And so it was really just a simple PDF document, and it was with regards to Trout Watchers. And as starting to know you, and now things are taking shape with our relationship, reading through this, the idea, and you kind of alluded to it, was y'all got training to cut out otoliths. And so the idea of the program, right, was to harvest fish otoliths out of trout 25 inches or greater, right?
Yes.
From across the state. So from Sabine all the way to Pontchartrain, or Shandy, right? Or Chandelier.
Wherever.
Yep. And then capture that data and then see by fish's age, I guess.
Yeah, what correlation would be.
Yes, sir. So you talked to Gerald yesterday. Did he mention anything about what he found? Because it's only little, I think, 2 or 3 page PDF doc.
It's not a whole lot. He really was not able to make a conclusion.
Okay.
Except that big fish are loners. They're totally different from small fish. And it might be a fish that's 3 years old, mm-hmm. or a fish that's 5 years old. And he could not correlate whether it was from this part of the state or, west, yep. or south, or it was just kind of random. And that he felt like it was more of a genetic thing.
Yeah.
A Shaquille O'Neal fish, unlike others.
So I have it pulled up right now. I'm looking at it. And so it was in 2003 and 2004. And from the west side of the state, there were 88 captures, or 88 otoliths. From the central part of the state, which you talked about, which would be Vermilion Bay, in that area, there were mm-hmm. 12.
Well, he said mm-hmm. that the reason that it was so low in that area was they were only able to fish 5 months a year, mm-hmm. And there weren't many guides or people fishing. So that wasn't a low number because there was a low number of fish. He thought it was because it was a low number of fishermen reporting.
Right. Okay. In Venice, there were 115, which, as you would imagine, mm-hmm. Venice is a very high participation rate. A lot of people go down there. It's the end of the sportsman's mm-hmm. paradise. It's one of the best fisheries in the world. And in the east, which would be kind of where you're at, would be 39. And so mm-hmm. I'm going to keep going here. So the ages, this is, I think, pretty interesting. For ages 3, so we're talking, again, keep in mind, 25-inch trout. In 2003, 3%. So let me go back. I'm sorry. So there were 254 total. In 2003, there were 161 captured. Of the 161, 3% of that was actually age 3. So aged at just 3 years old. So that fish reached 25 inches in 3 years of age, which goes back to your point of that fish being a genetic freak. And that mm-hmm. is the 30s. That is the true monsters. And I think that lends to Mike McBride's podcast when we talked about it, and him saying those 30-inch fish, people have to realize that those 30-inch fish make up 0.5%. You are people who are catching them and registering them. It's hard to do, right? I mean, that is
Right.
truly
Very, very hard to do. That was a conclusion that Gerald made too.
so. So keep going. This is where it's pretty cool though. Is that 4, 5, and 6 years are the highest percentages in both years, with age 4 being 33% in 2003. So of 161 of those otoliths that were captured, 33% of those were age 4. So we see that in the Louisiana fishery that a fish to reach 25 inches is pretty. That's not as long as I originally thought. I thought that fish
Well,
would reach that length and that
yeah.
size at a much older time, I guess.
Yeah, usual conventional wisdom is that they grow about a pound a year,
Mhm.
in which case an 8-pound trout would be 8 years old.
At about
And
28 inches, right?
that's not true.
Hmm. Yeah, you have these genetic
It
freaks.
could be 4 years old or 3 years old. It's just a genetic freak.
Yep. And so I'm looking at the list. So the cool thing, and I'll post this actually. I think it's pretty interesting, and I think a lot of our followers would be pretty interested in this. But Fish 3 was Doc Bob Weiss on the 9th of March, 2003, at a Pontchartrain, caught a 25.13.
What?
Yeah, I know, a 25-inch female trout that was 2 years of age.
Wow.
Yep. And so that's
A baby. If I'd have known that she was that young, I would have probably let her go.
the trend though that I saw throughout the entire list, both with you. So it was Dudley, it was you. I'm trying to look at some other names that I remember from the.
I tell you who else put a lot of them in was Ed Sexton down in
Yep.
Venice. I think he was catching a bunch of big fish then.
So Buddy Oaks, Mary Poe,
Oh, wow.
yep, John Perrin,
That's
Carl Zimmerman, Dudley, you, Timmy Landry. Let's see, Rudy Hall. So I mean,
Oh, Rudy is still fishing. I don't know him personally,
Mhm.
but this past summer, his grandson won the star
No kidding.
with a 6-pound trout.
That was him?
His son's name, yes,
No kidding.
his grandson, his son, who I know, is Mike Hall, and he lives in Mandeville, and he's a radiologist.
No kidding.
So Rudy and Mike and the grandson, whose name I can't think of, are still fishing like crazy.
That's awesome.
And the grandson won this year's star with a 6 something. I don't know what it was, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
incredible.
Terry St. Cyr.
Oh, Terry St. Cyr's caught so many big fish, it's not even funny. Bootsy Toops,
Yep, Bootsy Tubes.
Terry St. Cyr.
It's funny from fish 112 to 131 is all Ed Sexton.
Oh, Ed Sexton. Huh? Well, he's pretty competitive, and he wants to be out there in front of everybody and let everybody know it.
No, that's cool.
But he is very good. And one thing, I'll digress since you missed Ed Sexton. To my knowledge, the biggest string of speckled trout caught that I know of was Ed Sexton and the guy who has mud boats. I can't think of his name right now, but Ed caught a 10-fish string that weighed 77 pounds. And on that string was a 10.5-pound fish. And do you know what they were all caught on?
I don't.
That color that you like of the straight-tailed Dudley, that kind of lime color.
Yeah, that tangerine.
Tangerine, straight-tail, big Dudley.
I'll be damned. Where at?
At South Pass.
I'm about to say South Pass.
South
Okay, I was gonna say maybe the
Ed has a houseboat at South Pass, and he's had it for years there. So for him to fish the rocks at South Pass is like me fishing the rocks here at Treasure Isle, which is where I live. And Ed is really competitive, and there's no telling how many tournaments he's won with Dudley. And most recently, they have won several faux pas rodeo tournaments, and they fish hard, cant to cant, 3 days. I couldn't do it. If they invited me, I'd have to say, man, I can't do that.
Yeah.
So now that's a redfish, a trout, and a flounder.
I understand.
The combination of those three, they fish real hard, and they look forward to it every year.
Yeah. So the one thing I did notice though throughout that entire list was the ages, obviously, but the fish age from east to west side of the state. So from Jeff and Mary Poe on the west side to you and let's say Dudley and Ed Sexton, is that those fish in general reach 25 inches at a younger age on the east side of the state versus the west side of the state. That's just kind of me eye testing it, general observation. Did Gerald mention anything with regards to that?
No, he didn't go into the details of what his, what his conclusions were. No, we didn't talk about that. But he did refer me to the fact that the results were in the Troutmaster book that he wrote. And that's probably what you're referring to now. But we didn't talk about that.
So, Doc, seeing the change that you've had in throughout the course of your life in the Louisiana estuary, I mean, I know we've kind of talked and allude to it a little bit, but I mean, do you practice conservation a little bit more?
Do you know, I'm not sure what, I saw that question and I was going to talk to you that off the mic because I can't say I throw them back.
Yeah.
And conservation, yes, I would be conservation minded, but it would be more in terms of restoring or preserving what habitat we have. And I think that a lot of most of the loss of habitat, period, have been environmental changes, whether it's hurricanes or whether it's natural, erosion. And I don't know how to restore it, except that I'm for whatever efforts are made to try to restore it or slow it down.
Yeah. So, and that's, that's the thing is like, you don't have to be totally catch and release, but the idea of like, and I agree. I think the biomass in general in Louisiana is still the highest in the lower 48. I mean, to go out and catch, my dad went again throughout the course of his tenure in tagging those fish. The fact that he can go out there and average 48 trout per trip by himself, I don't know another fishery that has that level of production. You know what I'm saying? But my point there is that there is a sheer volume of biomass in the fishery, and I know we've talked about it. Me and my dad is that we've seen that decline, but on the same token, is I don't necessarily know if it's truly the fish, which I think there are less fish. But I think it goes back to your point, which is conserve them. And I really more so want to conserve what land we have and then bring that back and have a more concerted effort with conserving our resource, not the fish, but the actual environment in Southeast.
Absolutely.
I think we take that so for granted as one fisherman in Southeast Louisiana is that, man, what a diverse fishery. I mean, I've fished a lot of places in the world. I've fished a lot of trout fisheries in the States, and I've seen different estuaries and fisheries. There is nothing like truly getting lost in the Louisiana Delta. You can't do it. I mean, it's pretty impossible. And then not only that, like at every turn, you could stop and put a power pole down and catch 200 trout, really until your arms fall off, right? I mean, you could do that.
Absolutely.
So, but it goes back to without that, the actual like habitat, the marsh, the getting back to where you were talking about growing up and my dad, and that these bay systems are now the Gulf. That's the issue at hand. I think. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, well, we're at a little over an hour, Doc, and so
I can't believe
isn't that crazy? I know it's
crazy. So, when you just said I'm going to take a break, I looked at my watch and I said, "Wow, this was supposed to start at 8:30, and it's 10:30." Now I knew we took a half an hour to get the mic set up, but that's a good conversation, which I would love to have again, and I could do it again tomorrow, and I probably will. One person I want to mention that maybe one day you could talk to is my regular full-time fishing partner. His name is Alan Sumas, Sumas, and his nickname is Chink. Yep. Chink is 83, and Chink, I'll ask Chink if he's ready, and his answer is always, "I was born ready." Chink is from New Orleans, a Gentilly area now, And I would dare say that all of these people we've talked to have not caught as many fish in his lifetime as Chink. Everybody knows Chink. Everybody knows how good he is. Everybody knows he's still fishing and loves it. So anyway, I wanted to give a mention of Chink because he's so dependable, and I guess he looks at me as dependable. We use my boat all the time. He's anxious to go. He loves it just as much as the rest of us, and he's fished all over. Especially, he is a star and had been for years and years at Seabrook, which is close to where he lives now. But he's always ready. He loves to talk at different functions, and they have to put a hook and pull him off the stage with him talking about fishing. So in any case,
so that was actually, that was actually one of my last kind of questions, more or less, was, what are some anglers that you admire? And I think you've actually answered them through the entire podcast, and that would be Chink, as well as Dudley.
Dudley, Chink, Ed, Kenny Creeker, Jason Troulier, they're just a myriad of them. A lot of them. List goes on and on.
Right. Well, I want to ask you this too, Doc. So, in kind of to round out our show and to close it out, I'll ask you a few more questions before kind of giving you the reins to kind of say whatever you want. But do you have a certain time of year that you really enjoy fishing, or fishing for big fish for that matter, in the Pontchartrain complex, or even just in general?
Well, in general, I think the big fish are almost always caught in the spring. And in the summer. Toward the end of the summer, if you look at statistics, it's unusual to catch a big fish, for instance, in August or July. Big fish I caught was unusual to catch them that late in the year. But early in the season, for instance, the Star Rodeo, it starts in June. The earliest in June is good, but March, April, I'd say May, those are the best big trout times, whether it's here or in the in the Chandelier Islands and that area, Breton Sound. We didn't talk about Freemason, Breton. I never did fish there too much because it was always seemed to me to be a long trip. But some guys like the Halls, for instance, they run all the way from here to there, and they pass by. They pass by a lot of fish to go catch big fish, and they love to fish the islands: Freemason, Curlew, Gosher, Breton. So that's almost a different fishery almost.
Yeah. But time of year,
and a different way of fishing.
Yeah, but
what time of year?
Yeah, but time of year for you would be kind of spring, early summer.
Spring, yeah, and I think for them too. But I'm just saying it's just a different fishery. But early spring and summer. But there isn't a time that I don't go for something. During the winter months, like now, numbers are just incredible.
Well, we got to get you over here
but not real big ones.
Yeah, we got to get you over here to the Texas coast and get you in the winter wade fishery and see some of those big girls.
I would love to. And I mentioned to you, one of the guys that I went with, who I think is probably catches a lot of big fish wading, is Bruce Bowe. Beaugh, Bruce Barr, who's really close with the guy who made the Corkies.
Paul Brown, yep.
So Bruce, and it's just it's a pretty small group though, really, that keeps going around in circles.
Yeah, we'll have to get some of Pops. He still joins me, and he wades right next to me. He's young at heart as a 73-year-old man trying to. With a replaced hip and everything else, I put.
Wait a minute. Be careful about the age.
I said a young man, right?
Okay.
No, actually, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I'm probably a little harder on my pops than I should be because I still see my dad not as that age, and he doesn't have limitations. He just isn't as agile as he used to be, and so.
Well, it's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah, I went to that luncheon yesterday. There were 28 of us there, and we've all gotten old. That's for sure. A lot of gray hair, a lot of hearing aids. and a lot of stories about medical issues.
That's funny. Well, now we got to get you over here, and I think you'd be.
I would love to, and I still haven't met you in person. I know this is fun talking over the phone, but I would love to meet you. If you're down here, just let me know. And if
so
maybe you and I and your dad can go, and I think we'd talk as much as we would fish.
Yeah, let's maybe try to link that up if we can, because we'll be down there for the Christmas break and the holidays during that Christmas week.
That would be great.
If weather shapes up, let's do it.
Well, I've left out. I wrote 2 pages of things, and we haven't even touched on everything that I was going to talk about for fear of boring you. But maybe we can leave that for a fishing trip or another podcast.
All right. Well, let's do that. So, I mean, the cool thing about it is the guests that we've had have all been willing to want to come on again. And like I've told them, is that this is just season 1, right? We want to have multiple seasons of this thing and make it long standing. And so to have folks,
if we had a meeting kind of like AA or NA sitting in a group, and we had to raise our hands to say, my name is Bob Weiss, and I'm an addict. I think we could get a whole room of people that would do that.
We should get the Superdome, man. But right. Well, cool, Doc. Well, hey, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it myself.
So I always
made me reminisce about a lot of things too.
and it's always awesome, man, to hear those stories. And that's kind of what I've said before, is that it's important, I think, for folks, whether you're from North Carolina, Virginia fishery, or Texas, or not only that, even from the New Orleans area. If you don't know Doc Bob Weiss, this is a guy, an angler, a pioneer of our fishery, and somebody who's kind of put some footsteps out there for us to follow, right? And so it's important for us to know and understand that lineage. And so having you on the podcast is important for me, because I love hearing that. And I think it's important for folks to also hear that as well.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Doc. So I'll leave it to you. Do you have anything that you want to close with? This is any message or anything that you would like to to leave?
Well, don't look for a cure if you're addicted to fishing. There isn't any. And the only treatment that I know for it is to continue fishing and continue to enjoy it.
There it is.
That's all I have to say about that.
Because it's an addiction, Doc. So,
right.
Well, thanks, Doc, for telling us about your addiction. I think
you're welcome. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and meeting your daddy.
Hey, everyone. I want to say thanks again for joining the Speckled Truth podcast. We really, really appreciate it. And I want to say thanks again to our sponsors that support our podcast, and that is MirrOlure, Texas Custom Lures, and the Original Custom Corky, as well as Mossy Oak Fishing. Without their support, without their financial backing for that matter, this podcast doesn't happen. So I want to say thanks to them, and I want to say thank you to you for listening to the Speckled Truth podcast. We really appreciate the support, all the messages. Be sure to rate and then leave us a note of things that we can do better. And so until next time, guys, remember, take what you need, release the rest, tight lines, and God bless. Bye now. Again, none of this happens without the support of our sponsors from MirrOlure, Texas Custom Lures, and the Original Custom Corky. Without your support, none of this is possible. So thanks again to them. We hope to see you next time here at the Speckled Truth podcast. And we always want to leave you with this one tidbit. Always remember to take what you need and release the rest. God bless.